Please be seated. The psalmist today cries out, "Where are you, God? Have you forgotten about me? Am I to suffer alone, confused and in grief?" Verses like these are such an important aspect of the Psalms because they give us the grammar to talk to God, words for praise and rejoicing, and words of confusion, anger, and pain. For Christians, it is our best source for praising God and yet also for pouring out our doubts and frustrations. For the psalmist, these questions come from a place of feeling abandoned. His pain has gone on for too long, and he wants to know how much longer he must endure without feeling God's presence or protection. Seemingly alone, with no help from the Lord, his own grief and despair seem unmanageable. And with all this going on, the pain just keeps piling on as enemies seem to take advantage of him during his time of struggle. I can imagine many of you in the hospital here now are struggling with the same feelings. You might have even asked some of the same questions that he did. These are natural questions that rise up from deep within us in the face of profound suffering. And yet, they are the kinds of questions many are afraid to speak out loud. But the psalmist does say them out loud because confronting God with doubt and anger is an expression of faith, not a lack of it. It is an expression of faith because the questions themselves only make sense if we believe in a good God who is the author of good. The questions can only really be asked within the context of a faithful and trusting relationship. If God were an absentee landlord or a cruel tyrant, we wouldn't even ask the question. We might try to quietly toughen it out, or maybe even curse our very existence, but it would never occur to us to complain to God about it. The psalm reminds me of a story I've read about a pastor in Kentucky named John Claypool, whose 8-year-old daughter was diagnosed with leukemia. Now, Claypool had shepherded many people through their own dark and challenging times, but now that he was facing his own, he naturally turned to God and demanded answers. He asked what anyone would ask in this situation. Why has this happened? Why do little girls get leukemia? Why is there leukemia at all? And after 8 painful months of treatment, his little girl died. Claypool bravely shared that profound grief with his congregation in his sermons. In them, he talks about questioning God, stating, "Where then did Christians ever get the notion that we must not question God, or that we have no right to pour out our souls to God and ask why? Did not Job in the Old Testament cry out to God in the midst of his agony and attempt to interrogate the Almighty? Did not Jesus himself agonize with God in Gethsemane, telling God how he felt and what he wanted, and then cry out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" There is more honest faith in an act of questioning than in the act of silent submission. For implicit in the very asking is the faith that some light can be given. Now, some may be uncomfortable with the idea that we humans can question God in this way. Who are we to accuse God of failing to live up to our expectations? But it must be recognized that this isn't a cool-headed and rational response to the suffering we face. No, it is rather a visceral reaction from people who trust in God but are feeling betrayed as they struggle with pain and grief. It comes out of a deep hunger for God's justice and love. Spoken in the context of a relationship, which is what happens in prayer, such questioning of God is itself an expression of our love of God. This kind of prayer is exactly what the psalm is giving witness to. It isn't that God must be scolded or pestered into caring about human suffering, but rather that prayer is a means of relationship with God, in which he gathers up our cries and our laments, our praises and thanksgivings, and in some mysterious way allows them to be part of his greater work in the world. So do not be afraid to share in the faith of the psalmist by crying out to God with words of confusion, anger, and pain. For God has a lot to give an account for, but he's big enough to handle it.